Well, we've reached a hinge point in this course. Yes, we're going to see plenty more sculpture and architecture, and yes, we have already seen many paintings. But with the Renaissance, with the development of new tools such as linear perspective, new materials such as oil paint and paper, new markets for a wider variety of subjects, and the new embrace of individual artistic vision, well, painting comes into its own. So this is a good point to pause briefly to fill our analytical toolbox. What are we looking for when we look at paintings? I'm not going to read these analytical slides, by the way. We have too much ground to cover today. But hang on to them, since we will return to these questions again and again for the remainder of the year. Let's practice analyzing content with this first painting in the unit. So what is this painting about? And why might this subject matter be significant? Well, you all know the story, right? The three wise men or magi visit the Christ child. But why would this particular subject matter be significant to Gentili's patron, Palestrozzi, the wealthiest Florentine of his day? It seems pretty clear that people in the painting aren't Franciscans set on renouncing their worldly goods. Look at their elegant clothes, their beautiful horses. On the one hand, this painting, as your textbook puts it, sanctifies the aristocracy in the presence of the Madonna and Child. I would guess, though, that the patron also wanted the artist to emphasize that even the wealthy, even the powerful would bow before Christ, the patron included. Our next set of tools falls under the broad category of style, the techniques a painter employs to build a painting. So let's go back to Gentile da Fabriano's adoration of the Magi. The term international style sums up a number of style choices. So what are some of these? Quick review. Well, we see the sumptuous court dress, the heavy use of gold, expensive pigments. But this painting is significant because it also represents a transition between medieval and Renaissance art. So what Renaissance style elements do you see? Well, look at the horse's rump in the bottom right corner. What technique has the artist used to convey where the horse stands in space? Well, the horse's behind is foreshortened. It's larger as it faces toward us. The animals in general are more naturalistic. Now, I've mentioned before that animals often were rendered naturally before people were, but in this case, the human faces also show a considerable amount of individuality. The light seems to have a definite source. It's the Christ child. It's not this sort of just diffuse heavenly light. And the painting conveys a lot of movement, actually conveys movement right up to the point where the Magi confront the Christ child. And there, at that moment, the movement stops, freezes, adding to the emphasis on that moment. Content addresses the subject of the painting. Context, and those two words are a little too similar for comfort. Context addresses why the artist pursued this particular subject and these techniques. And by the way, sometimes the answer is that the patron asked him to. Okay, continuing with the adoration of the Magi, I've zoomed in on a portion of the picture to help answer the context questions, again with this painting. We don't actually know that much about Gentile da Fabriano. He worked for wealthy patrons. He was influenced by the Sienese school, and we know that the patron of this painting was very, very rich, and this patron almost certainly chose the subject for the painting. Art historians seem to agree that Palestrozzi shows up in the wealthy crowd descending on the stable. They disagree about which individual is Palestrozzi. I've circled what seems to be the most commonly identified candidate, but we don't really know. What we do know is that this subject was very popular in the merchant cities of Italy. Why do you think? Well, again, remember that the rising merchant classes were ambivalent about their wealth. Franciscans were the most popular preachers in Italian cities. The church condemned lending money at interest. Yet the scripture describes men of wealth and power who worship the Savior, and this is one of the most important incidents. And by the way, there's no indication that the three wise men renounced their worldly goods. And now we get to our final set of questions about function. What purpose does a painting serve? Who would view it? What did the artist or patron hope to achieve with this work? Well, our last look at the Adoration of the Magi. Artists did not expect their works to hang in museums when they painted in the Renaissance. There weren't any museums yet. There were churches, there were private homes, there were public buildings, such as the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. Now, the function of this particular work is pretty straightforward. It was an altarpiece, more than 9 feet tall and 9 feet wide. What reaction was the artist looking for? Remember, this is an important part of its function, and many pieces of art have a religious function. Presumably, the artist is looking to inspire awe that even the rich and powerful would bow before Christ, and awe, let's face it, at those spectacular colors and all that gold. The painting conveys the power and wealth of the patron and the church. And as for the patron, he probably wanted both to display his wealth and to display his piety and win favor with the church, with God, and remind worshipers that rich guys could get to heaven too. Okay, let's take these same questions and apply them to a much more important work. And let me warn you, this one is a real College Board favorite. Hint, hint. This is Tribute Money by Masaccio. Now, the painting was one of many frescoes in a private chapel commissioned by the Brancacci family. The chapel is often compared with the Arena Chapel in Padua, with its paintings by Giotto. And Masaccio was clearly influenced by Giotto's style. He also moved beyond Giotto and is considered by most art historians to really be the founding painter of the Italian Renaissance. So the subject of this painting, to get to our first set of questions, is a story that is content, is a story that appears only in the book of Matthew and has rarely been depicted in art, or at least had rarely been depicted in art at this point. So the Apostle Peter was challenged by a tax collector. Did this Jesus pay the temple tax? And he said yes, but in the dialogue that follows, check out Matthew 17. Jesus tells Peter, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others?" "From others," Peter answered. "Then the children are exempt," Jesus said to him. "But," Jesus goes on, "so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." So the content is a religious narrative. The context, that is the outside elements that influence this painting, is much debated, but some art historians think that the patron or artist wanted to express support for taxes that Florence officials were collecting to raise more money for the defense of Florence. Florence was constantly under threat from outside enemies. We don't even know whether it was Brancacci or Masaccio who chose the subject, although it's more likely to have been Brancacci. The function was to aid family devotions, as this was a private chapel. And by the way, I should note that most of the murals in the chapel, in fact, depict scenes from the life of St. Peter, and that was significant as well as a political message. Because the great political, and this gets very complicated, but the great political divide in this period in history was between the party of the church, the Guelphs, and the party of the nobles, the Ghibellines. Florence, as a merchant city and that housed the bankers to the Pope, tended to side with the papal party. Peter, of course, was the first pope, and Jesus giving the keys of the kingdom to Peter was part of the church's claim to rule. So in asking that his chapel be decorated with scenes from the life of St. Peter, the patron is basically indicating his political allegiances. But what really makes this painting important is style, the way Masaccio built the painting. The fresco contains 3 separate parts of the story, all shown in the same frame as a continuous narrative. In the center, we see Jesus debating with his disciples. Peter is the fellow with the beard. To our left, and by the way, I just note how Roman some of these profiles are, particularly John, who is between Peter and Jesus. But to our left, Peter pulls a coin from the fish's mouth, and on our right, he pays the tax collector. And this continuous narrative is really more medieval in style than it is Renaissance. We're going to see less of this as the Renaissance goes on. Masaccio's fully modeled figures, like Giotto's, have volume and weight. Notice Giotto's Lamentation in the corner. But Masaccio goes beyond Giotto in several regards. One is his use of aerial perspective. Note that the mountains are blurrier, lighter, and bluer than the people, buildings, etc., are being portrayed in the foreground. Oops, here we go. Masaccio was also I'm sorry. I'm messing up here. Let me get back to my slides. Okay, here we go. Masaccio was also a close friend of Brunelleschi's. And in fact, there's speculation that Brunelleschi cooperated, actually not in this painting, but in the Holy Trinity, which we'll see in a minute. But Masaccio was very familiar with Brunelleschi's studies of perspective, and note how the orthogonals converge on Christ's head. This is a very deliberate use of perspective and composition. Masaccio also made far more use of the contrasts of light and dark to define volume and space, and we're going to see a great deal more of this as we move forward in the course. The term for this contrast between light and dark is chiaroscuro. And oops, I'm sorry. Once I went backwards, that thinks I want to continue to go backwards. Okay, here we go. Here's an illustration of this very important term. And you see how light reflects on a ball, and essentially chiaroscuro is an artist's effort to replicate this optical vision, much as perspective is an effort to replicate how we see objects in space and a distance. I'm sure you remember the extraordinarily evocative Adam and Eve from Sister Wendy's video. The photo on the left, as you look at it, gives you a sense of where both the tribute money and the expulsion of Adam and Eve in the garden fit into the scheme of the chapel. Note, by the way, the similarity between Masaccio's Venus and Praxitelli's Venus. Masaccio would have seen copies of the statue. They littered Italy. Masaccio, by the way, did not originally get the commission for the Brancacci Chapel. It went to Masolino, who was a well-known painter in the International Gothic tradition. This painting isn't in your textbook, but it is part of the Brancacci Chapel frescoes, and I think it provides a very interesting contrast and indication of how painting is developing. Note not only the far greater emotional depth of Masaccio's painting, but its use of chiaroscuro, its more thoroughly modeled figures, its sense of movement, and basically the portrayal of Adam and Eve as three-dimensional figures in a three-dimensional space. This painting is even more famous for its exquisitely careful use of perspective. I'll get there in a moment. But let's first look at the content, context, and function. Again, back to those questions. The subject is the Trinity. God the Father holds up God the Son as God the Spirit. It's a rather hard-to-see dove on Christ's head. The viewer's eye is drawn up to the figure of the Trinity, but also down to the skeletal memento mori, or reminder of death. The deep recess, which is entirely a pictorial illusion, all the architectural features here are painted, draws the viewer into the scene and therefore into communion with the triune God. The perspectival composition of this painting is extraordinarily accurate and extraordinarily complex. Note that the composition is based on a series of triangles, or on pyramids and inverted pyramids. This itself is a representation of the Trinity, the three parts in one. Also, note that the patrons are larger than the figures of Mary and John at the base of the cross. Now, since they're closer to us in space, they should be larger from an optical perspective. And indeed, optical perspective has replaced conceptual perspective here. Again, you've already heard Sister Wendy discuss this painting and Fra Angelico. Just a few additional notes. By the way, this is a painting you also need to know. The division of interior and exterior space was typical of Giotto's frescoes and also of Fra Angelico's. The open courtyard in which the angel confronts Mary was, and still is, called a loggia. I particularly love the brilliant color on these wings. So what's happened to the halo in this picture? It's almost disappeared. Like Giotto's Madonna, these figures have weight and substance. Oops, there comes Giotto's Madonna. But this Mary and baby are much more human, even more sensual. You may recall from the Medici video that Fra Lippi was not particularly saintly. Fra Angelico, he was not. Although his Mary, I think, has some of the same sweetness as Fra Angelico's, and also reminds me of Botticelli, whom we're going to get to in just a minute. Now, so far, we've looked entirely at religious paintings. But the Renaissance emphasis on individual achievement, the admiration of Roman portrait statues, the growing patronage of a wealthy merchant class all created demand for portraits. Remember, there was a lot of portraiture also in ancient Rome. Here are two paintings by the Florentine painter Ghirlandaio. The one on the left appears in your book. The one on the right doesn't, but I particularly like it. Notice how much individual personality comes out, even in the rather austere profile portrait of the woman, who is probably, but not certainly, Giovanna Tornabuoni. Okay, we've been practicing close reading of content, style, context, and function. I'd like to give you a break now and let you hear someone else's analysis of some famous paintings. Let's start with this painting, one of a series commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici's grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent. You're going to watch two brief clips from a longer video analysis of this painting and the historical events behind it. These clips focus first, or the first clip focuses on Uccello's use of mathematical perspective. The second focuses on his mastery of naturalistic detail. A link to the full video is available on Moodle. It has a lot of interesting information on military history, by the way, a subject I'm personally interested in. You might check it out if you have any extra time, which you probably don't, given the homework burden of this unit. I'm going to end this lecture with the works of Sandro Botticelli. Now, there's more painting to cover in this chapter, but I think that you will have had enough to absorb in one setting. So you all recognize this painting, right? Botticelli was one of the many painters who lived on commissions from the Medici family. This work is tempera on canvas, and it tells how Venus was born out of sea foam and carried on a cockle shell to her sacred island. Actually, the story from the classical text is considerably more gruesome than that. It involves, among other things, incest, and castration. If you'd like to check out the original account from the ancient Greek author Hesiod, I've given you the link, which is going to be on Moodle as well. But consider this a parental advisory. This is not for the faint-hearted. Now, Botticelli was far less obsessed with perspective than his Florentine contemporaries. He was more a fantasist, not as mathematically oriented. And not as scientific. In some ways, his work seems closer to the international Gothic style, these sumptuous clothing, the courtly faces, but the use of chiaroscuro, the clearly modeled bodies, and the dramatic movement all set Botticelli's work apart as part of the Renaissance. Botticelli is also known as a master of line. You'll see this even more clearly when we get to the Primavera, a painting that is not in your textbook, but we're going to examine at some length because I have a very good video analyzing this painting that I wanted to share with you. But first, let's take a look at some other paintings by Botticelli, who has a very distinctive style. So the statue on the left is, and by the way, I said we were going to look at other paintings, but actually we're going to look a little more closely at the birth of Venus first. The statue on the left is the Venus de' Medici, or the Modest Venus, a 1st century BCE Hellenistic copy, probably, though not certainly, of another work by Praxiteles. And it was also one of the Medici family's prized possessions. Notice the resemblance. And again, this may very well have been a request from the Medicis, or it may have been an effort by Botticelli to please his valued patron by imitating one of the major works in their collection. Now, I was also surprised that this work wasn't in your textbook, and I guess not everything can be. My AP materials indicate, at least from the course I took this summer, this is one of the works you should know. We've already noted that the adoration of the Magi was a popular subject with Florence's merchant patrons. The patron who commissioned this piece was a banker related to the Medici family, and a banker who was well known for rather shady financial practices. So this is a somewhat questionable guy who may have felt that he had to earn a little favor with the church. Now, the architect and art historian Vasari raves about how Botticelli captured the individual personalities of people in this painting, which is all the more intriguing now that we know that several of these figures are actually identifiable historical personages, some of whom Botticelli would have known. So, the older man kneeling in front of the Virgin is Cosimo de' Medici. He'd actually died by the time that this was painted, but this closely resembles other portraits we have of Cosimo. The arrogant young man on his left, and I love this painting, is his grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, and we'll hear more about him. The figure on the right, looking out at the viewer, actually there's some controversy. The most common view is that this is Botticelli himself, and it looks like other portraits we have of Botticelli. There's some speculation that it was another member of the Medici family who actually betrayed the city. So here's a closer look at a couple of these portraits. I particularly like Lorenzo, who looked like a cocky teenager, doesn't he? He had a great deal of money. You'll notice that Botticelli's beautiful women bear a certain resemblance to each other, though no actual model has been identified. This is showing Venus and Mars, by the way, were married to one another. Mars was the god of war. Mars has obviously been conquered. I'll leave it to you to speculate what activities they've been engaging in. This painting, along with the birth of Venus and Primavera, which we'll see in a moment, are sometimes referred to as furniture paintings or even bedroom furniture paintings. They were private paintings intended for the bedroom. The long, narrow shape fit easily over a bed and may, in fact, have been part of a piece of furniture. We're going to see more about that and about the possible context for these in a minute. So in that spirit, let's turn to one of Botticelli's most famous bedroom paintings, one that rather unaccountably to my mind is left out of your textbook, but one that I suspect many of you have seen. Sorry about that. Okay, the first clip introduces this painting, while the second clip offers some background on Botticelli and on the Medici patronage that supported him. You're going to see a lot, but not all of this video. I think we actually may watch the last part of it when we get to the 19th century, so there's a hint. Our next two clips provide more context for the painting. In the first clip, you'll see how Botticelli bent the rules of Christian art while following many of its conventions. And in the second clip, we're going to learn about the context for the painting. An arranged marriage, perhaps with rather reluctant participants who needed a little, well, encouragement to fulfill their dynastic responsibilities. And now we turn to Botticelli's painting technique, which is followed by a discussion of possible philosophical themes in the work. Remember that Cosimo de' Medici sponsored and actively participated in Florence's famous Platonic Academy. The last clip talks about the symbolism of Botticelli's meticulously rendered flowers. Remember the point I made earlier about line. Whew, lots of paintings, and in the next lecture, still more to come.